There was a moment in history when war stopped being the business of kings and became the business of contracts. For centuries, empires rose and fell on the strength of men with swords. Victory belonged to whoever was braver, stronger, faster. Then everything changed, quietly, almost invisibly. No announcement, no declaration, just a shift in who held the real power. Cannons needed iron, gunpowder needed saltpeter, ships needed timber, rope, credit, and insurance. Armies transformed into supply chains. And the moment war depended on supply chains, merchants stepped into the center of power. Not through elections, not through conquest, through invoices and ledgers that nobody ever put on a monument. Welcome to History Burns, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. Today we trace a 700-year thread. From medieval banking halls to trillion-dollar defense budgets, hold one question in your mind the entire time. Not who started the wars, but who made sure they could keep going, because those two answers lead to very different places. And by the end, you will never read a defense budget the same way again. The arms trade did not begin with factories, it began with financing. In late medieval Europe, rulers were in a constant state of war. Territorial conflicts, dynastic struggles, religious campaigns that dragged on for years. These wars were expensive, devastatingly expensive, and monarchs, men with absolute power over millions, regularly ran out of coins to sustain them. So they did what any business does in a crisis. They went looking for credit. Italian banking families were the ones who answered the call. The Lombards, the Florentines, the men behind the curtain of every major European war. They lent to kings who needed to pay mercenaries. They lent to rulers who needed to buy equipment, horses, and cannon. And in doing so, they made a discovery that would reshape the world. War was not just a matter of courage. It was a matter of liquidity. No money, no army, no power. The general was supposed to be the most important figure on the battlefield, but the banker was the one who decided whether the battlefield existed at all. And this was only the beginning, because by the 15th century, the real demonstration of financial power was about to happen. The Fugger family of Augsburg were among the wealthiest banking dynasties in all of Europe. They had built their fortune through trade, copper, silver, textiles, but their real power came from something else entirely. They had learned to finance emperors. In 1519, Jakob Fugger provided the decisive financing for the election of Charles V, the election of the Holy Roman Emperor, the man to whom dozens of states owed obedience. The most powerful ruler on the continent won his throne, not because he was the strongest, because he had the best banker. That election reshaped European politics for the next 100 years. And the Fuggers collected their return, in influence, in contracts, in copper and silver concessions. The Fuggers also supplied copper and silver for weapons production. They were not generals. They were not kings. But they decided which head wore the crown. Meanwhile, something equally significant was happening in the Mediterranean. The city of Venice had built something unprecedented, an industrial arsenal. The Venetian arsenal in the 15th century employed thousands of workers. It produced warships and cannons with assembly line efficiency 400 years before Henry Ford. Venice was not simply defending itself, it was selling weapons across the entire Mediterranean world to whoever was willing to pay. Christian states, Muslim states, rivals, enemies, allies. It did not matter. Weapons are a commodity, and commodities flow toward payment, not toward righteousness. So by the early 16th century, the basic template was already in place. Bankers who financed wars, manufacturers who supplied weapons, merchants who moved the materials, and rulers who depended on all three just to maintain their power. The triangle of finance, industry, and force was already forming. It would never fully dissolve. Not in 500 years, not across any political system, not under any flag. But the true stress test was still coming. In 1618, Europe entered one of the most destructive conflicts in its entire history, the 30 Years' War. What began as a religious dispute would explode into a continental bloodbath. Spain, France, Sweden, Denmark, dozens of German states, 30 years, millions dead. And for our story, what matters most is what it did to the supply side. Chaos generates demand. That is the cold arithmetic of any prolonged conflict. Demand for muskets, demand for artillery, demand for iron and gunpowder and the credit to finance it all. And where there is demand, there will always be someone to fill it, regardless of which side is in the right, regardless of which god is being invoked. Sweden became a major exporter of iron and military equipment during the war. Dutch merchants supplied multiple warring sides simultaneously, crossing religious lines without hesitation. Neutral traders did business with everyone. And here is the quiet truth that rarely gets spoken aloud in official history books. Ideology moves soldiers. Contracts move supplies. A soldier dies for his beliefs. A supplier profits from them. These two realities coexist inside every war that has ever been fought. The discomfort of holding both at once is why most history books choose one and ignore the other. The 30 Years' War devastated Central Europe in ways that took generations to recover. Some regions lost up to a third of their entire population. Entire cities disappeared from the map. Villages burned not once, but repeatedly, by armies fighting under different banners, needing the same supplies. But the weapons manufacturers did not disappear with the casualties. The bankers who financed the campaigns did not vanish with the corpses. They became indispensable, and that word, indispensable, is the most dangerous word in the history of political economy. Because once something becomes indispensable, it gains permanence. A permanence that no treaty and no peace agreement can simply dissolve. The Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 finally ended the 30 Years' War. It reorganized borders, it redrew maps, it changed everything on the surface. But the supply network stayed intact. The foundries stayed open. The economic infrastructure of war simply waited for the next conflict, which never took long to arrive. Now here is where the story accelerates, because something entirely new was coming. Something that would transform war into a mechanized industrial process. By the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution had arrived, and it arrived at war's doorstep carrying blueprints. Steel production was scaling, railways were reshaping logistics, explosives were becoming more powerful with each passing decade. War, which had once been seasonal and local, almost like a harvest, only with casualties, was beginning to look like a mechanized enterprise with planned outputs and quarterly reports. And at the center of this transformation stood a family. A German family whose name would become synonymous with industrial war and the raw power of steel. The Krupp family of Essen. They had been metal workers since the 17th century, but in the 19th they became something else. Alfred Krupp transformed a modest steel workshop into the largest industrial enterprise in Germany. He was obsessive, demanding, visionary, and he understood one thing above all else. The future of war would not be decided by the bravest soldiers. It would be decided by whoever had the best steel. By the time of the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 and 1871, Krupp's cannons had proven the point. France, considered the dominant military power in Western Europe, was crushed in weeks. Not because of cowardice, not because of poor strategy, because Prussian artillery was forged from superior steel, designed in engineering offices, mass-produced in industrial foundries. Industrial steel had become more decisive than military spirit. That sentence would have been incomprehensible to a general 100 years earlier. No amount of courage could close the gap between an iron cannon and a steel one. The physics simply did not allow it. And that gap was now being manufactured on an industrial scale. In Britain, firms like Vickers, Armstrong, and Whitworth were supplying not just the British military, they were selling to foreign governments across the globe, to anyone who could pay. The line between national defense and international commerce had ceased to exist. Weapons were no longer forged by craftsmen who knew the soldiers who would carry them. They were engineered in design bureaus and shipped in maritime containers. War had become a supply chain problem, and supply chain problems attract businessmen. Then came Alfred Nobel. In 1867, he patented dynamite, and in doing so, changed the energy of destruction forever. Nobel was a chemist, an inventor, and a businessman all at once. His discovery revolutionized mining and construction, and made artillery shells dramatically more lethal. One invention, two completely different trajectories, and a man caught uncomfortably between both of them. When Nobel died in 1896, his will established the Nobel Prizes, including, with exquisite irony, the Nobel Peace Prize, a fortune built on explosives, a legacy consecrated to peace. Historians still debate whether that was genuine conscience or something far more complicated. But here's the moment where the story shifts. By the late 19th century, the arms trade had evolved beyond simply filling existing demand. It had begun to create demand, to shape the threat perceptions of governments, to manufacture urgency in the minds of politicians. The naval arms race before the First World War is the perfect illustration. In the early 20th century, Britain and Germany were locked in a competition to build the most powerful fleets in history. In 1906, Britain launched HMS Dreadnought, a single ship that made every existing battleship on Earth obsolete overnight. Every navy in the world suddenly needed to start over, and everyone who built warships understood exactly what that meant for business. Shipyards expanded capacity, steel output surged, defense budgets grew on both sides, each escalation justified as a response to the other side's escalation. This was not spontaneous tension. This was industrial momentum. Factories had government contracts. Workers depended on those contracts for wages. Investors depended on those factories for dividends. And politicians depended on those workers for votes. Military capacity had embedded itself into the national economy as a load-bearing structure. Remove it, and the whole building risks collapse. That is not a metaphor. That is a structural description. And in 1914, that structure was tested in ways nobody had fully anticipated. When the guns of August 1914 began firing, the scale of industrial warfare stunned everyone, including those who had designed the weapons that were now being used. Machine guns, heavy artillery, submarines, poison gas. These were not products of military genius. They were products of industrial laboratories and assembly lines. Killing had been industrialized, and now the industry ran at full capacity, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Governments mobilized entire economies for the first time in history. In Germany, Krupp's factories became the beating heart of the war supply. In Britain, civilian factories switched to ammunition production. In France, total industrial coordination was achieved through emergency measures that would have seemed radical just months before. The United States declared neutrality, but neutrality, as it turned out, was a political position, not a financial one. The firm of J.P. Morgan became the principal purchasing agent for Britain and France in America, organizing billions of dollars in credit, managing enormous supply deliveries across the Atlantic. By 1917, American financial exposure to an Allied victory was so vast that true neutrality had become mathematically impossible. When the United States entered the war in April 1917, the boundary between financial involvement and military participation had long since dissolved. War financing was not a patriotic duty, it was balance sheet management. And the balance sheet had already made the choice. months before Congress voted. By November 1918, when the guns finally fell silent, the world expected a reckoning. 4 empires had collapsed. Around 16 million people were dead. Surely people believed the mechanisms that had enabled such carnage would now be dismantled. Surely the world had learned its lesson. It had not. The supply networks stayed intact. The foundries stayed open. The bankers stayed in business. Public outrage simmered through the 1920s. And in 1934, the United States Senate did something remarkable. It created a special committee to investigate the role of the arms industry in America's entry into the war. Chaired by Senator Gerald Nye of North Dakota, bankers gave testimony. Weapons manufacturers defended their records. Internal correspondence became public, and the press gave the moment a phrase that still echoes today. The merchants of death. It was specific. It was damning. And it changed the political conversation overnight. DuPont had made enormous profits on explosives. J.P. Morgan had arranged more than $3 billion in loans to the Allied powers. The argument was not that these men were villains who started the war. It was that once the war started, their financial interests made real neutrality structurally impossible. This is the distinction that matters above everything else, not conspiracy or incentives. That is a fundamental difference. If your bank has invested $3 billion in loans to one side of a war, your geopolitical position shifts on its own, without any board meeting, without any secret directive. The incentives simply point in one direction, and rational actors follow incentives. That is not a scandal. That is economics. The Nye Committee hearings triggered a wave of isolationism across American political culture. The United States passed a series of neutrality acts in the mid-1930s. The intention was clear: sever the financial connection that had previously dragged the country into foreign war. But systems do not dissolve through hearings. They adapt. In Germany, Hitler's regime was rearming in direct violation of the Versailles Treaty. Krupp was expanding again. Britain and France were growing their defense budgets. Each side justified its expansion as containment, as deterrence, as a defensive necessity, as it always is. Nobody ever officially announces they are preparing for conquest. By 1939, the Second World War had begun, and this time, the scale exceeded anything human civilization had previously witnessed. The United States, initially neutral, became what Franklin Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy. Through the Lend-Lease Act, America began supplying the Allies before formally entering the war. American factories were working at the absolute edge of their capacity. Automotive plants were producing tanks. Aviation manufacturing expanded at an explosive rate. By 1944, the United States was producing close to 100,000 aircraft per year. Military spending grew from under $2 billion in 1940 to over $59 billion by 1945. A 30-fold increase in 5 years. And that number contains a secret that most economics textbooks quietly skip past. The Great Depression did not end through monetary reform. It did not end through austerity or patience or moral recovery. The Great Depression ended through military production. Defense spending functioned as a fiscal stimulus of unprecedented scale. It absorbed unemployment. It loaded idle capacity. It demonstrated something uncomfortable. Economic despair and military expansion could be solved by the same mechanism. The template had been established, and it would not be forgotten. State spending on military production could function as the engine of an entire economy. When the war ended in 1945, the question arose again. Would the industrial apparatus contract? Would the supply chains dissolve? Partially, but not fundamentally, because almost immediately, a new conflict began taking shape. The Cold War with the Soviet Union. Nuclear weapons arrived on the scene. The stakes became existential. Deterrence required readiness. Readiness required production. Production required contracts. The circle closed, and it has never reopened. Throughout the Cold War, defense spending remained structurally elevated. Companies like Lockheed, Boeing, Raytheon, and Northrop Grumman became load-bearing pillars of the American economy. Weapons exports became an instrument of geopolitical influence. Client states were supplied not just with ideology, but with specific weapon systems, creating dependencies that lasted decades. A country armed by America was a country oriented toward America. The transaction was commercial. The effect was strategic. The Soviet Union did exactly the same on its side of the divide. Warsaw Pact countries received Soviet weapons, Soviet advisors, Soviet technical systems. Weaponry was not just a product, it was a form of political adhesive, binding allies to patrons through the practical dependency of spare parts, training, and compatible systems. And then came January 17th, 1961, a date that most people know exists but whose full weight they have never truly absorbed. Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe during the Second World War, delivered his farewell address to the American people. And in it, he said something that no one in his position had ever said before. He warned of the military-industrial complex, not as a distant threat, not as a foreign danger, as a domestic structural reality that had grown up inside the American system while people were focused on other things. He warned that the conjunction of an immense military establishment and a large arms industry was new in the American experience, and its influence was felt in every city, every office of government. Pay careful attention to what Eisenhower did not say. He did not accuse specific companies of engineering wars. He did not point to secret conspiracies. He was pointing at structural alignment of interests. When entire regions depend on defense contracts for employment, the system sustains itself automatically, without malice, without conspiracy, without any meeting or directive, simply because every participant has a rational reason to press the button marked "Continue." Eisenhower was not a naive critic. He had commanded the largest military operation in history. He understood military necessity, but he also understood incentives. He had watched the industrial machine mobilize, perform, and then, instead of standing down, simply find new justifications for its continued existence. He was not warning about what the complex had already done. He was warning about what it was structurally capable of doing, without anyone needing to decide. By the end of the 20th century, global arms trade had become fully formalized and institutionalized. According to SIPRI, the United States alone accounts for roughly 40% of global arms exports. Fighter jets, missile systems, drones, surveillance technology, all embedded in decade-long contracts that stretch across multiple political administrations and election cycles. The annual United States defense budget now exceeds $800 billion. China's military budget exceeds $200 billion. NATO members collectively spend over $1 trillion per year. Let that number land for a moment, $1 trillion annually, just on preparation for war, not on war itself, on readiness, on the permanent capacity to destroy, on an industry whose product has no peacetime use. War, or preparation for it, is no longer an interruption of economic life. It is an economic sector, with employees, with shareholders, with lobbyists, with analysts, with supply chains and quarterly earnings reports, exactly like pharmaceuticals, exactly like energy. And here is the foundational logic that has never changed, not in 700 years. Conflict generates demand. Demand generates contracts. Contracts generate profit. Profit generates influence. Peace, by contrast, reduces urgency, shrinks budgets, and reduces orders. In financial terms, the arms industry is countercyclical to peace. This does not mean wars are invented for profit. That explanation is too simple, and it is wrong. Wars ignite for political, territorial, and ideological reasons, for the accumulated weight of historical grievances that no economist ever designed. But when preparation for war embeds in an economy as a structural element, incentives begin to shape decisions. Budgets get defended, threats get emphasized, strategic narratives get amplified, not because anyone is a villain, but because every participant has a rational reason to see the situation exactly as the system rewards seeing it. The defense contractor sees a dangerous world requiring more weapons. The politician sees a constituency requiring protection. The economist sees a sector supporting hundreds of thousands of jobs. Each of them is telling a version of the truth, and the version they tell happens to align perfectly with their incentive. The arms trade did not corrupt otherwise clean systems. It evolved alongside the financial system as its organic counterpart. As states grew more complex, as economies industrialized, as credit markets deepened, the capacity to produce violence scaled alongside them. The medieval banker financing a royal campaign, the 19th century industrialist forging artillery, the 20th century contractor lobbying procurement committees, the 21st century multinational exporting drone systems and cyber capabilities. These are not separate stories. They are nodes on a single continuous chain, stretched across 7 centuries. The technology changes, the actors change, the justifications change. But the underlying structure, finance enabling force, force creating demand, demand sustaining finance, has never altered. History does not repeat in identical form, but the pattern repeats with remarkable consistency. In the 30 Years' War, it was iron and gunpowder. In the First World War, it was steel and credit. In the Cold War, it was nuclear deterrence and trillion-dollar budgets. Today it is advanced weapon systems, cybersecurity, and global semiconductor supply chains. The material changes. The logic never does. The microchip powering a modern weapons guidance system is the same class of component that powers your smartphone. The separation between civilian technology and military technology has become almost theoretical. The semiconductor export controls the United States imposed on China since 2022 are as strategically significant as the ability to deny iron and gunpowder was in the 17th century. The material changes. The logic does not. And if you understand the logic, you can read each new chapter before it fully unfolds. Now let us bring this to the present moment, because recent history has made many of these dynamics newly visible in ways that were somewhat theoretical just years ago. The war in Ukraine, which began with Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022, demonstrated in real time the rate at which modern industrial warfare consumes weapons and ammunition. Artillery shells, anti-tank missiles, air defense systems, drones by the hundreds of thousands. The consumption rates proved far higher than any Western defense ministry had stockpiled for. Countries that had spent decades reducing their ammunition reserves discovered those reserves could be exhausted in weeks of high-intensity conflict. European defense spending surged across the continent after February 2022. Germany, which had constitutional constraints against significant military spending since 1945, created a special €100 billion defense fund almost overnight. Defense company share prices reflected this shift immediately. Lockheed Martin, Rheinmetall, BAE Systems, Thales. The stock markets processed the geopolitical signal within days of the invasion beginning. Long before any government had formally updated its defense budget, long before any contract was signed. Financial markets priced in the coming wave of military spending faster than political systems could respond, because financial markets, unlike politicians, do not need to hold press conferences. The Lombard bankers of the 13th century would have recognized the mechanism perfectly. The technology is different. The calculus is identical. True financial literacy is not just about understanding stock markets and bond yields. It is about understanding which sectors are structurally protected and why, which budgets are politically untouchable and how they got that way, which supply chains run through geopolitical fault lines and what that means for prices and stability. The arms industry sits at the intersection of all of these questions. Understanding it changes how you read the news, interpret government decisions, and evaluate geopolitical risk. War is not the failure of the economic system. For significant parts of the modern economic system, war, or the perpetual preparation for it, is a feature, not a bug. A feature. This does not make it good. It makes it something far more difficult. Structural. And structural problems require structural understanding before they can be addressed at all. Understanding is not the same as accepting. Knowing how something works does not mean endorsing it. But misunderstanding it, treating it as a simple story of villains and victims, guarantees that you will consistently be surprised by outcomes a clearer analysis would have predicted. Empires did not fall because they fought too many wars. They fought too many wars because there was always someone ready to supply them. And because the financial system made doing so not merely possible, but profitable. The logic never changed, only the technology did. And in that gap between unchanging logic and accelerating technology lies everything you need to understand about the world we currently inhabit. If this analysis gave you a new way of seeing, subscribe to History Burns, because the past is not finished. It is still happening. In every defense budget, in every arms contract, in every geopolitical alliance shaped by weapons dependency. History is not a museum. It is the architecture of the present.